Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the classic original 62 book series. And it's book number 33, The Horror at Camp Jellyjam. Now, me and this book go way back. This was the first book I read after my mom had acquired two books for me at a yard sale, which were The Werewolf of Fever Swamp and A Night in Terror Tower when I was around the age of 6 or so. And I read those two. And I went to my second or third grade classroom in the beginning of the year and went to my teacher's bookshelf and saw that she had this book on there. And I was always mesmerized by the cover. And it took me a few days. I remember trying to work up the courage to read this because the guy looked so creepy on the cover that it scared me. And it still kind of does till this day. The iconic Buddy the Camp Counselor cover is one of my favorites from the original 62. And I finally worked up the courage and read it. And I remember reading it a few times when I was a bit younger. I don't think I ever got around to rereading it when I was around the age of 13 when I got back into rereading the books temporarily. But I figured that I read the book so much when I was, around the age of 8 to 10 that I didn't need to read it again. And reading it as an adult, it's one of those books kind of like The Werewolf of Fever Swamp, right? I've often called this the Werewolf of Fever Swamp of the Goosebumps camp books. It's the book that if you read it once, you've read it every other time you go to read it. When you know the twist to it, it kind of spoils the rereading factor to it. But nonetheless, reading it for this review purpose, kind of reacquainting myself with the nostalgia I have for it, I did find myself enjoying this book. Now, is it my favorite camp book in the series? Far from it. Some people might be disappointed by me saying that, and I even wore this new shirt that I got from Journeys a while ago with Buddy on the shirt to kind of represent. I do enjoy this book, and I do think it's a classic for a reason. But I think there are better. Now, is it a good book? Would I recommend it off the bat? Yes. If you have not read The Horror at Camp Jellyjam, you should really read this book. This actually might be a great gateway into Goosebumps book, especially if you're a new reader or you're younger and you don't really know where to start. I think this book in recent years has gotten a classic Goosebumps reprint. Now, I don't know if that one's out of print. Like, I know the Phantom of the Auditorium and Please Don't Feed the Vampire and a few other ones from classic Goosebumps are currently out of print. I don't know if this one is like that. You might be able to find it, you might not. But if you can't get your hands on this, try it out. I think most people will get some enjoyment out of it one way or the other. But with that out the way, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away, y'all. So the story starts off with these two siblings named Wendy and Elliot. And they are riding in their family vehicle with a trailer towing on the back of it to go to this excursion in the summer. And the kids are really bored on this trip. They don't like playing these car games that the mom and dad keep telling them to play. They much rather be in the trailer behind the car. And you get a sense of these two characters and how bored they really are. And they act kind of annoying at first. But the parents eventually kind of cave in. And since these kids who rather be at summer camp have to spend this long trek in this car, they thought that it might be fun to pull over, let them go hang out in the trailer behind the car for a little bit to kind of, decompress and not be so bored. So when they do that, the parents' worst nightmare comes true, essentially. While the kids are in the trailer detaches, and these kids start tumbling down this mountainside on this journey that they're on. And they end up falling down this slope and coming to a stop. And when they realize where they're at, they get greeted by these camp counselors at this summer camp. So it's almost kind of like Wizard of Oz. It has a lot of Frank L. Baum influence in this story. I think Stein channeled that here. But they ended up in this magical camp that they've always wanted to go to. And the camp is themed a sports camp. And it's called, I think it's called King Jellyjam Sports Camp or just Jellyjam Sports Camp or something like that. And Elliot's super excited because he's super competitive and super athletic, and he can't wait to do this camp. And Wendy is kind of relieved at first that they landed somewhere safe, but she's also kept in the back of their mind that she needs to keep tabs on where her parents are, and maybe they're going to come looking for them. And she gets consulted by these counselors who say, hey, you can stay here as long as you need to. If your parents contact or come by to visit, we'll tell them that you're here. So Wendy's cool with it, and her and her brother end up getting split up into a boys' and a girls' dorm of sorts, which was kind of refreshing for a camp book that Stein tends to write. Normally, they don't stay in dorms. They stay in, like, camp lodges. On the cover here, you see these little dormitories. You can't really see the other one because on this version, the decal of doom is blocking it. But there's another one supposed to be right behind here. But that's like the girls and that's the boys, right? And that's pretty much all of the exterior that you can see at this camp. But Wendy tries to make the best of it and gets taken by a counselor to her room where she has these roommates. And her roommates are called Deidre, Ivy, and Jan. The running gag of the Goosebumps camp books is that there's normally a Jan in the story. Just know that. But all of these girls are really into this camp, and there's this motto that goes around that Wendy overhears when they first come to the camp, and it's called "Only the Best." And that's kind of a metaphor that these other girls drill home to Wendy, is that, yeah, at this camp, you have to be on your A game. You have to be competitive. You have to have that urge to win. And one of the first things Wendy has to deal with in the story is being asked to participate in a swimming competition. And Wendy seems to be confident about this. In her monologue, which is kind of decent in this book, she's talking about how she's more of like a casual swimmer and a casual tennis player, but she's never really been on the competitive side. She's never really done like sparring and athletic settings with other people. So this is all new territory for her. But she reluctantly agrees to go do this, and she ends up having to race against one of her fellow roommates, Deidre. Now, Deidre also mentions that she needs to win this so she can win her final Jellyjam coin, which is this thing, I guess, where every time somebody wins a competition, like let's say they play softball or play tennis or whatever sport and they win this Jellyjam coin. And if you win up to 6, you get to walk the winner's walk. And that's like the most coveted thing that campers get to do at this camp. So Wendy learns firsthand what that is because she goes to race Deidre in the race, and at first she's doing very good, trying her best, but then she realizes she doesn't need to win, and she thinks that Deidre might want this more than her, so she lets Deidre win her final coin, and Deidre is so happy and excited, she can't wait to celebrate later on. She's planning this party that's going to be at the room that later that day after the Winter's Walk ceremony, which they hold, I guess, every day of the camp. And she wants all the roommates to be there, and she wants all of them to be there to watch her walk the walk. So Wendy's, amicably excited for this. But one of the counselors pull her aside and says, hey, look, this is kind of a warning, but at this camp, you can't be just, not trying your best. You have to be on your A game. You have to be giving it your all. And Wendy's taken back by this. She's like, why do they value competition so much here? She really can't seem to grasp what's going on. But meanwhile, she ends up reconnecting with her brother Elliot, who seemed to have gathered his own group of friends through his roommates or such. And he's starting to participate in certain matches, and he wins his first Jellyjam coin in a ping pong match that she goes and watches. And there's this thing that she does to kind of make him cool off, because since Elliot's so competitive, he gets kind of hot-headed in a poor sport. So she'll blow a whistle at him to calm him down, and that might play a role later on in the story, which I like Stein. I like it when Stein puts some bait there that actually has some payoff. So, yeah, she calms him down, which allows him to win, and he wins his first coin. And then pretty much from this point on for the rest of the story, Wendy is getting this idea that something is off, something's creepy. The camp counselor, Buddy, seems to be overly chipper, right? And it all starts when they go to watch the Winter's Walk to see where Deidre is going to end up and see what the ceremony might look like. And they see a bunch of kids walking, and Deidre looks excited, everybody's waving, and then everybody is told to leave, and the Winters are supposedly supposed to come back to the dorms, right? So she goes back to the dorm with Ivy and Jan, and they're all sitting there. They just grab some snacks from the commissary. They're waiting on Deidre to come back, but Deidre never shows up. And Wendy, in the back of her mind, says something might be wrong. And they kind of make a joke saying, hey, maybe we should go look for Deidre. And it pretty much comes to head at one point of the story. Now, I'm going to kind of skim the surface here because I am going to start getting into spoiler territory, essentially. But let's just say there comes a point where Elliot starts winning a bunch of medals. And Wendy is trying to call home frantically. But she picks up a bunch of phones that are outside. And it has this weird, morbid message saying, like, of the Jellyjam mascot saying, you know, hey, camper, blah, 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 you should be doing this. And Wendy thinks that all these phones are fake. Something's wrong. The counselors seem a little too chipper. They want us to be constantly competing. And there's this one scene where a counselor tries to essentially force Wendy to go participate on a softball team so that way she can at least get her first coin. And she ends up accidentally hitting Buddy in the ribcage, which should have shattered his ribcage with, you know, because she was swinging a bat at full force. And he acted like it didn't hurt him. It didn't faze him. And throughout the story, she observes Buddy and is like, hey, he's not even affected by pain here. There needs to be something needs to be done. So her and her friends decide to eventually, you know, go out exploring. And they end up finding this girl named Alicia. And this may or may not have happened before this event, but maybe I should bring it up here. The girls did try to leave the camp dorms, which they're not allowed to after 10 o'clock. And they're trying to go around the camp to maybe look for Deidre or maybe some hint of what happened to her. And they come across this girl named Alicia, who may or may not be in the beginning of the story. And I've already skimmed over her character for a reason. But Alicia is pretty much warning these girls that something's wrong with her. She needs help, but she doesn't know how to explain it. And she ends up being terrified and running off. So Wendy also takes the liberty at some point to ask Buddy, hey, what happened to Deidre? What happened to this girl named Alicia? And Buddy is kind of creepy, and he's like, oh, well, they say that they just left the camp. And she knows something's off about that, right? So all this plays into the end portion of the story here. Elliot, at this point, has acquired a lot of coins. He's on his pretty much last one that he needs to get. And Wendy decides to go do her own sleuthing and ends up following the counselors one day into the woods. And there's like this igloo structure in the woods. And she follows them in there. And pretty much it goes bonkers from here. There's an igloo with like a cult shrine inside of it, where like these torches are, and these camp counselors are pretty much being hypnotized to worship this King Jellyjam figure. And she is terrified, and she tries to go searching around this area that's inside of the igloo, and she comes across this door with a putrid smell, and she opens it up, and she essentially sees what's happening with these kids, these potential winners, and may or may not discover who this real King Jellyjam is and what kind of creature he is. He's kind of described to be like a purple blob that has the power of like shooting snails out of his skin. Yeah, it's very bizarre, right? And you kind of learn why the people of the Winter's Walk are sent there, right? So Wendy takes all this in and realizes that she needs to get help. She needs to save these kids. So she has to go find Elliot, and she manages to stop Elliot right before he wins his final coin and convinces him to come follow her, and they go back to the igloo. And something may or may not happen there. Wendy comes up with this idea potentially to save the day. And I don't want to go any further than that, but let's just say the camp saga wraps up, and the ending of the story picks up in the events after the summer camp is over. Let's just say there's something that happens near the end of the climax that reunites the kids with their parents. And the parents tell this really bizarre story that really paints into context the sinisterness of what these kids were going through. And let's just say a character from the story ends up getting reunited with Wendy and Elliot, and the ending kind of ends on a lighthearted note, and that's where I'll leave you there. But that's essentially what you're going to get out of the Horror at Camp Jellyjam. Now, let's start off with the positives of this book, because I do have a lot with it. Off the bat, I want to give praise to Stein with the character Wendy. Now, Wendy is not the greatest protagonist ever, but Wendy was definitely one of the more digestible protagonists that I've read in the series so far. She has a lot of personality in her monologue. She's very honest. She's very non-self-centered. She tends to care about her brother's well-being and her parents' well-being, almost to the point where she comes off selfless. And I like that about her character. She's also into athletics, and she's into physical activity, but she's not competitive, and that's not a side of her that she's interested in going down. And that's a nice contrast to have her in this environment where everybody around her is ultra competitive. And it does make an interesting character study when you're reading the book, especially in like a critical lens, to really get a sense of what her character must be going through. And it's very easy to understand some of her decisions in the book because she's not that way. And I really appreciate that Stein made the effort to not just have a kid thrown into like a guilty pleasure type situation, and they just purposefully regress in the story because they're eating themselves alive with their own ambitions and their own self-centered ways. She was the stark contrast the story needed, and I loved Wendy. Elliot, he was kind of annoying at first, but Elliot was also a good side supporting character. I liked all the roommate characters. Deidre, even though she was ultra competitive, she seemed mildly down to earth and mildly realistic, which I can really appreciate. Jan and Ivy had some fun moments here. And the camp counselors, I think their names were Holly and Buddy. Buddy's the main star here, though. They were creepy. And they were pretty much the main thing that was causing this uneasy feeling throughout the whole book. There's also little side characters like Alicia. And then, of course, the main character, King Jellyjam, the main bad guy, right? While we got to see him in the final act of the book, he was an intriguing monster. Could have been done a bit better, and we'll get into that in the negatives, but he had some fun, unique things about him. Overall, the tone of the story, it felt very whimsical. Like I said, it felt like a Frank L. Baum Goosebumps story. Like, if the creator of Wizard of Oz was to create a Goosebumps book, it would be this. It's so bizarre. It's very pre-pulp, turn of the century type of horror storytelling. It's almost kind of like an H.P. Lovecraft meets a Frank L. Baum story. And I'm kind of impressed that Stein was able to just create a whimsical fairy tale in like a camp setting. That's what it comes across as. And there is some layers of the story to kind of peel back, like the perils of the competition, and subverting expectations with that was kind of smart. And I will say, even though this is a book that I've read many times in my life, you can still see the payoff and some things planted in the book that end up getting paid off, like the whistle thing with Wendy to Elliot. That is actually smartly put in there. There are some moments with plot convenience in the plot, typical Goosebumps problems, but I do think that this book was a little more thought out and planned out compared to your average Goosebumps book, which I also appreciate. And the setting, while not the greatest, it was definitely passable. Not my favorite in-depth camp description ever. It seems more generic than your average camp book, but it was still a good atmosphere. I like the dormitory changes. A lot about it just sticks out compared to the rest. But with that being said, let's get into the negatives. Because I guess there's nowhere else to go here. There are some negatives with the story. And I will say this. For a story that has such a whimsical way of beginning, I think it has one of the best, I'll go ahead and say this now, it has one of the best first few chapters in Goosebumps history. How this story gets set up is so bizarre and weird that it's so much fun. But once you start getting into the camp around chapter 5 or so, from chapter 5 to like chapter 15, honestly, it's just kind of monotonous. It's that simple way of, you know, setting up the story, establishing side characters, having a character go participate in a sport, and it kind of drags until around page 55 to page 60. There are some mildly dull moments to the story, and there's really no conflict during this portion. And I think that if Stein were to like tweak some certain character elements, maybe made Deidre more competitive than she actually came across, and there was some drama between the girls, and maybe the girls feared Deidre. Deidre was somebody to be afraid of. Maybe that would have been a cool little coy moment to have in the early stages of the book. Buddy was not really prevalent all that much in those chapters to carry that first portion of the story. And I found myself this time around kind of noticing how uneventful this book is compared to the other camp books, which seem to be like hit the ground running for the most part, minus Curse at Camp Cold Lake. That's like first half of just monotony. But Ghost Camp, right? Ghost Camp and Welcome to Camp Nightmare, they have action by that point of the book. This is just setting up a slow burn type of story. And like I said in the beginning of the video, this is essentially the camp version of Welcome to Camp, the Werewolf of Fever Swamp, essentially. It's a very slow burning type of story. Not saying that every book needs to be hit the ground running, but I just kind of wish there was more to that section of the book. My other negative is pretty much near the climax portion of the story. There are some very convenient things going on for my taste. The first thing I want to point out is there is like absolutely no context involving how these camp counselors are being brainwashed by Jellyjam, the origins of all this, of pretty much how these camp counselors came to be, right? What started all this, and that's to be expected, right? You know, you don't need too much explanation, but maybe just one paragraph worth of just throwing it out there, maybe near the end of the book, where Buddy just kind of potentially explains what happened to him or what he thinks happened to him. Just something like that, right? There's none of that to kind of help make this story make sense, because there's this conclusion you have to come to with King Jellyjam, right? When you learn what needs to be done for him pretty much all the time, you're thinking in your head, well, is this camp open every day of the year? What are they doing on the off seasons of the camp to help this King Jellyjam operation keep going? What are they doing? And there's also another thing involving the town nearby, which when you read the climax near the end, you'll come to the conclusion like, all right, so there's a town nearby, and they get triggered because of the smell that leaks out. I'll kind of mildly spoil that. But you mean to tell me that nobody smelled the smell beforehand? Nobody? There's absolutely no context. Like I said, with the whole smell in the nearby town, there's no context of how these camp counselors came to be. There's no context that this camp is open 24/7. I mean, it's just all just predicated on the suspense of disbelief of the reader, right? Which is fine to a certain extent, right? But when you're throwing reveals in a slow burn book at the very end of a climax, and you're throwing things out willy-nilly with no explanation, Stein, that bugs me. That really bugs me. Now, not to say that it doesn't work as a shock value moment. If there's anything I can give this book a compliment for, is that it is pure shock value in the end. It goes that route so it doesn't have to try to explain some complicated story, which it kind of is, right? It would be one thing if the story overall didn't take itself too seriously and it was just a willy-nilly type of book with a bunch of just random stuff, one of those throw some random crap in there, hey, kids will buy it, Stein books, and you get an ending like that. That's one thing. But when you have a serious tone book like this, and you kind of just throw a monkey wrench near the end, you got to make sure it sticks. And this is a common ailment in Goosebumps books, unfortunately, and Jellyjam is no different here for me. The context and some disbelief just is kind of egregious, okay? And my last negative with the book, unfortunately, this one's more heavy for me, unfortunately, is the lack of real intimidation of King Jellyjam. Now, that might be a controversial take. Some people are like, whoa, 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 completionist. Jellyjam's one of the best villains in the Goosebumps history. Look, Jellyjam's iconic. Okay, I get it. King Jellyjam, he's one of the fan favorite monsters for a reason. I mean, he's actually said to have previously eaten kids in the book, right? But we don't see any of this happen, right? And there's also a thing, right? And I guess I should mention it here. This whole conclusion that Wendy comes up to defeat King Jellyjam, I should say, is very shoehorned in, and there's like really no real way that's earned in the story. Like, how does she come to this conclusion? It's very random, and like I said, when you read it, it's very sudden, and you're like, where did she come up with this idea, right? How did she think of this? But besides that point, he seems kind of easily defeatable, right? And the whole thing that makes him gross, and I guess this might have creeped kids out in a weird way, is like just imagining a big giant purple blob just spitting out snails out of its skin. That's kind of gross, right? And he's a gross character, don't get me wrong, but we never get to see any action of him actually doing something sinister on page. We never get to see him actually do something to kids. This is not like the ending of Werewolf Skin where you see a character get violently bitten by a werewolf. This is not like Welcome to Dead House where you see a kid have his face melted off by a flashlight. No, this is some silly, weird old monster that is said to do stuff off page and we don't get to see it on page, right? This could have gone way darker, right? And the whole cult aspect, I kind of wish that Stein leaned into more of that, and that's also a mild negative with it. We got some cult business to it, and we get who the cult is worshiping. But I actually wish they played up the cult aspect way more in the story. I think that's a hindsight issue. That if Jellyjam ever got a sequel, or maybe even an episode adaptation back in the 90s TV show, I would have hoped that the writers of the TV show, potentially, or the Stein writing the sequel, would play more into that cult aspect and play it up more. And drop more red herrings in there. Because that stuff was great. And to be honest, Jellyjam, you know, for what he is, he's serviceable, but he is kind of a weak villain to me. Just me personally. I mean, there's better villains out there. He's kind of silly. I don't know what else to say. But nonetheless, from a 0 to 5 star basis, Horror at Camp Jellyjam, those problems I have were kind of small to mediums, and they did add up. These were like 0.2s to 0.3s a piece. But collectively, I deducted 0.8 off, and I gave this book between a 4 and a 4.5, right at a 4.2 out of 5, which is a middle-of-the-road B. This is a B-tier Goosebumps book. It's above average. It's very entertaining. It has a lot more praisable things than weaknesses. Now, there are some things that just annoy me about it. I do think that, at least in terms of the classic original 62 book series, Welcome to Camp Nightmare and Ghost Camp are just on a completely different level than this book. But this book is also on a whole nother level above Curse of Camp Cold Lake, so it is what it is. That's just my opinion. Some people might disagree, but that's just how I feel. But yeah, still a solid book after all these years, and I'm glad I reread this and acquainted myself with the nostalgia of it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Horror at Camp Jellyjam. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.